Thank you very much. So the phenomenon of Henri Bergson's philosophy not only lies in its innovativeness and originality, but in the speed with which it gained popularity in European countries, including Russia. In 1913-1914, a 5-volume edition of the philosopher's works was published in Russian, including all of his main writings. Not only the Russian symbolists Alexander Blok, Andrei Bely, Ivanov appealed to Bergson's ideas, but also members of the Russian avant-garde, both from the artistic world, the futurists, and the scientific world, the formalists. The French philosopher also had a considerable influence on the Russian intuitivism of Semyon Frank and Nikolai Lovsky, who published the book The Intuitive Philosophy of Bergson in Petersburg in 1914. And in emigration, Russian philosophers continued to turn to Bergson from time to time, although they rather did this out rather mechanically through inertia. Firstly, because his philosophy had ceased to be regarded as relevant, and secondly, because of the funeral works by Bergson, who in the 1920s, 1930s published only 2 main works, the two sources of morality and religion, 1932, and The Creative Mind, La Pensée du Mouvement, 1934. However, it should be clarified that this drop of interest in Bergson was characteristic for the older generation of Russian philosophers and writers, for whom the experience of immigration was not an experience of a radical reassessment of philosophical and artistic values. At the same time, at the period between the 2 wars, the new so-called younger generation of Russian immigrants came onto the stage, who had developed intellectual baggage in exile and had the opportunity to immerse themselves directly in the current philosophical and artistic life of Europe, and above all of France. For the young immigrants, who as a rule knew French better than their fathers, it was more natural to go directly to the originals. At the same time, young immigrants were not only attracted by recent texts by the philosopher, published in the 1920s, 30s, but all of his work as a whole, starting from Time and Free Will and Matter and Memory. It's curious that there were practically no philosophers among them, if one doesn't count Vladimir Yankelevich, who came from a Russian Jewish family but was born in France, and published a book in 1931 devoted to Bergson. Interest in the philosopher was shown by young writers Gato Gazdanov, Vasily Yanovsky, and Boris Poplavsky. Perhaps a certain role in this was played by Bergson's winning the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1927. But generally, the deciding factor was that the most important problem that immigrants faced was the problem of memory, which was portrayed with particular vividness by Bergson. From this point of view, the heritage of Boris Poplavsky, young immigrant poet called by the Russian exiles the Prince of Montparnasse Kingdom, is of particular interest. In 1920, 17-year-old Boris leaves Russia and settles with his family in Istanbul and later in Paris. In Istanbul, he reads mystic and anthroposophist studies. A tense religious feeling, leading sometimes to ascetic self-restriction, was peculiar to him for all his life. During several years, Poplavsky contributes to a Modernist review numbers in Russian, where he chronicles the artistic life, writes reviews, publishes his poems and fragments of the novel Apollo the Ugly, 1932. He authored also a novel Home to Heaven, published entirely in 1993. Depressed, he dies tragically in 1935 from an overdose of heroin. I would like to analyze the poetical attitudes of Poplavsky, which he formulated in the spring of 1929, and which are directly connected with his understanding of the problem of time. Time becomes an important category of his metaphysics of art. Art, he postulates, is born from the conversation of music with art, the manifested spirit with the sphere of reflection and freezing. End of quotation. Music is a manifested spirit, localized by Poplavsky in the sphere that he calls the second world, which is an external movement. The first world is the world of primary, motionless, and we may suppose ideal, forms born by the eternal spirit. It's not hard to see that Poplavsky reproduces the Platonic structure of the ideal, tangible world quite accurately. In Plato, the absolute idea is opposed to the dyad, the principle of multiplicity, and of these two fundamental principles, the one and the dyad, Poplavsky calls them spirit, other ideas arise that are arranged in a hierarchical order, and their birth cannot be interpreted as a temporary process. The second world, as the world of movement, where forms inhale and exhale darkness, is also evidently linked with Plato's idea about the participation or non-participation of an idea in other ideas, and about its non-being in relation to all other ideas. However, Poplavsky places emphasis on the fact that forms may die, but at the same time does not see dying as disappearing, but as change, one type of forms flowing into others. He then writes about the formation of a third world, the sphere of reflection and freezing, which forms because the ideal forms begin to cool, as if falling out of musical movement. The entropy of forms is not given to the poet in thought, but in feeling. Thought in general is devalued by Poplavsky as sometimes subjective and even substantial, so it may be reproduced. Feeling is unique and lends itself poorly to verbalization. I quote, "You feel like writing a thought down that doesn't disappear without trace, because a thought doesn't disappear but remains in the memory. But it's always much more objective and externally resembles the object which one can oppose oneself to. But the soul wants to resurrect a certain feeling of the days, the long since vanished mornings, those years, for the thought can be remembered, for the tale of it remains forever, which you want to drag out of the memory about what it was. No, a certain feeling of those days, that is something quite unique. Souls sometimes feel that something is happening to them, that they are experiencing something endless and valuable on the corners. But what exactly they cannot say, and sometimes with the forces of physical attack, certain states of a particularly significant worry take place, endless and sweet. And sometimes the first line suddenly forms, that is with a kind of special song. The words come together on their own, and they become a kind of magical signal to memories. Just as sometimes in a musical phrase, an entire dead spring is registered, or, for me, in the scent of mandarin rind, an entire Christmas in the snow in Russia, or all my pre-war childhood in the waltz from the Merry Widow." End of quotation. We should know that at first glance it's not memories that become a signal to the production of images and words, but vice versa, phenomena that are given in the experience of sensory perception, for example a scent, a musical phrase or a visual image. These phenomena set off the mechanism of memory. Here Poplavsky, it seems, deviates somewhat from the Platonic concept of memory as anamnesis, that is, the reactivation of truth contained in the depth of the soul. Poplavsky seems to orient himself towards sensory perception, adapting for his own needs the Proustian concept of involuntary recollection. In Proust, however, the process of memory, which in its most intensive manifestations borders on hyperamnesia, is connected with the switch of the consciousness from perception to memory as a result of a loss of contact with reality. The phenomenon of hyperamnesia, described by Bergson in Material and Memory and in the Oxford lecture of 1911, The Perception of Change, is inherent to the consciousness of the dying person, turning off the present in favor of the past, reborn in memory. As Georges Poulet explains, I quote it in French, ce phénomène qui est celui de la perception hypermnésique de leur vie entière par certaines personnes en danger de mort fournissait à Bergson une preuve précieuse d'une de ses convictions les plus chères, la preuve qu'aucun souvenir n'est définitivement enseveli dans l'oubli, et qu'il y a en chacun de nous, affleurant notre conscience, une sorte de mémoire totale, qui, en de certaines circonstances, peut nous restituer intégralement le temps perdu. It's difficult to say who Poplavsky is more obliged to here, Plato with his doctrine of noetic knowledge, which keeps specific ideas in the field of the transcendental, or Proust with his tendency to shift the object remembered into the field of the immanent. If for the Greek philosopher anamnesis establishes a link between the subject and the absolute objective reality of the transcendental world of ideas, for the French writer, recollection is experience of one's own past as the immanent reality of consciousness. Of course, Poplavsky talks about what memories evoke the scent of mandarin rind or the waltz from the Merry Widow for himself. But at the same time, the possibility itself of recollection, provoked by essentially a fathomable phenomenon, is determined by a certain state of particularly substantial agitation, which does not emerge from the contemplation of a concrete phenomenon. Gabriel Marcel noted the fact that in Bergson's conception, a musical work is primarily aimed at freeing us from the past as a series of past events. Listening to the waltz from the Merry Widow, Poplavsky also experiences his childhood not as a series of past events, but as an indivisible unity of the past. We may therefore say that a state of particularly substantial agitation doesn't so much arise from a sensory perception of waving flags, shining asphalt, or the scent of mandarins, but from the not easily defined experience of all of this, in which, in my opinion, sensory perception is inseparable from intellectual intuition, from speculation. In Poplavsky, this experience of all of this doesn't come down to the sum of experiences of visual, acoustic, or olfactory forms. Paying attention to the dependence of the poet's arguments on Platonic philosophy, we may assume that substantial agitation as a combination of sensory perception of phenomena and the contemplation of non-sensory parts of the whole, to use the expression of Mikołajowski. So this substantial agitation manifests itself as a form of recognition that finds only a partial analogy in Platonic anamnesis. It's significant that Poplavsky devotes a considerable section of his argument to speculations about pure time, I quote. Thus, it's quite correct to say that outwardly, expression time has erased this inscription is completely false. As outside time is not a force, it does nothing, it's only a system of counting, number, measure. Inwardly, I identify time with a force, a world developing inwardly. Here time is life itself in essentia, in the band where it's also a pressure and a possibility, and from where it disperses into accident and necessity. End of quotation. It may seem that Poplavsky, unlike Proust, doesn't connect the concept of pure time with the problem of memory and recollection, and places the emphasis on the free creation of the new and previously non-existent. I quote again. The fact is that in pure time, the layers of it seem to be dispersed, only the outwardmost layer can be embodied in reality. Inside time, we dream and hear a free, actively prophetic layer, which hasn't yet been able to become embodied, which is still only seeking embodiment, that is, this pressure, the center of which is directed to the future. In deeper layers has a song of the future. There is a kind of eternal aspiration far beyond the boundaries of what is actually realized. To listen to this inner formation, which is still possible, which hasn't found, almost not yet found embodiment, is the function of a truly noble poetry, as it seems to us. The future is not far, but within the present, and the first world that it breaks into is always art. But to serve the future, which strives towards embodiment, that is obeying the eternal rising sound of time, to create feelings that no one has yet experienced, and landscapes which no one has yet seen, is something that only a poet can do, who is internally, morally in agreement with the spirit of music. End of quotation. This passage precisely reproduces the Bergsonian concept of time, which distinguishes time as a physical phenomenon and time as an inner time of consciousness, which is characterized by la durée. From the outside, says Poplavsky, time is only a system of calculation. Inside, it's a constant formation directed towards the future. At the same time, the future in Poplavsky, as in Bergson, doesn't have its own status, and is an aspiration towards an action that has already been determined in the present. The present is imbued with the past, which is actualized when in actualized form appears in the present in the form of a memory image, souvenir image, which is necessary for carrying out a future action. This is why an emphasis on aspiration to the future is not a form of denial of the past for Poplavsky. When he says that a poet should create feelings which no one has yet experienced in landscapes which no one has ever seen, he understands that these feelings and landscapes can only be defined as new in comparison with old feelings and landscapes. The past is necessary to create the future. In other words, the future is impossible without the work of memory. In this sense, Poplavsky moves far away from the futurists to whom he himself belonged at the beginning of his creative path, from the futurists with their project of radical rejection of the past. At the same time, we should pay attention to the fact that for Poplavsky, memory is not the emotion of some experienced feeling as the same thing. When he smells the scent of mandarin peel, he remembers how mandarin smelled in his childhood, and then he moves to memories of Christmas, but he is not capable of feeling Christmas as something given in immediate perception. He talks about this clearly himself, a feeling of those days that is completely unrepeatable. Here he differs from Proust, who stated comme les souvenirs involontaires nous font goûter la même sensation dans une circonstance tout autre, il la libère de toute contingence, il nous en donne l'essence extra-temporelle. Thus, the scent of mandarins or waltz or a word are just a signal to memories, but they wouldn't be perceived as signals if they were not conditioned by the substantial agitation which transcends their sensory nature and is ontologically linked with the second world, which Poplavsky calls the world of music. The same goes for objects. When Poplavsky looks at a flag waving, the flag is not just perceived as visually given, but also forces the mechanism of memory to work, which make it possible to identify a flag as a flag. Although a flag may at a given moment not at all be the same weight it was at a certain moment in the past, and although it's like this, it's still identified as such. The flag is the flag. At the same time, Poplavsky compares, it seems, not even two different flags, but two feelings of the same flag, and his memory once more proves incapable of reproducing a feeling of those days. He has a memory about the vanished feeling, otherwise he could claim that the new feeling didn't resemble the old one. Substantial agitation is born out of this very split between perception and imagination, feelings and memory. It's the quiet, mystical emotion, musical state, an emotion in which is a form of cognition. It seems to me that for Poplavsky, a poem is a form which takes the substantial agitation that seizes the poet, and at the same time, the poem is the suspicion that it is unlikely it will be possible to realize this. In other words, the text acts as a product of mnesic failure. In 1935, Poplavsky writes in his diary, I quote, "At dawn, returning home, when exhaustion is placed by a magical, painful, glassy excess of forces among the painfully distinct morning houses and trees, entire books open in the blink of an eye. They are brought before our eyes, but you shouldn't even try to record them. The dead, stony fatigue before the transition will crush your head, and I often fell asleep with my face in the exercise book, where there were just 2 or 3 completely meaningless phrases written down." End of quotation. Creativity paradoxically grows from failure and exhaustion and deprivation, which turns into its opposite, excess. Entire books are brought before their eyes. What is this but substantial agitation? However, an attempt to realize this agitation only results in a few phrases. Here we may once more recall the hypnotic panorama of the vision of the dying. As Georges Poulet states, puisque c'est l'acte positif de l'attention à la vie qui dénie à l'esprit la conscience de la vastitude et de la richesse de la vie, il faut que ce soit le retournement de cet acte, le changement de cette positivité en négativité, qui permette à l'esprit de reprendre contact avec cette richesse et cette vastitude. La vision de Mourant est l'exemple parfait de ce changement de pôle. Elle n'est rien de positif, elle est absence d'action, absence d'intérêt, inattention, négativité pure. It must be said that Bergson experienced difficulties in explaining this phenomenon. Is panoramic vision really indivisible merging or the multiplicity of adjacent details? Bergson finds a solution in the Oxford lecture Perception of Change, in which he applies the theory of reversal of thought to the topic of panoramic vision. Once again, a quotation from Poulet. Ici, point de glissement dans le rêve, ni de fléchissement de l'attention. Celle-ci, renversée, invertie, prend possession d'un univers mental qui ne s'éparpille plus. Totale, vivante, mouvante, composée d'une multiplicité d'instants hétérogènes qui s'entrepénètrent, l'existence se découvre dans son élan invisible. Et le visionnaire bergsonien qui la contemple, à la différence du penseur intermittent qu'est Proust, ne contemple pas une coexistence d'éléments juxtaposés. Au lieu d'accéder à l'éternité et de tomber dans les multiplicités numériques, il atteint ineffablement à l'intuition du mouvement qui constitue sa vie intérieure. Bergson insists that a thought which weakens its links with the present should not weaken the force of attention, allowing it to think that it thinks. A thought should turn away from actual life but should not become a dream. And I conclude, it's important that Poplavsky, as an attentive reader of Bergson, uses his concept of time not only to formulate his own poetic method, but in order to determine the specific nature of the situation in which the young generation of Russian immigrants found itself. Indeed, if their childhood took place in Russia, intellectually and creatively they formed in Europe. Rejecting the literature of the older generation of immigration with its obsession on lost Russia, at the same time they didn't want to become French writers. Their choice was to write in Russian, but not to write about Russia, but to write about the Russian person outside of Russia. For this immigrant person, Russia doesn't exist as a directly given experience, and not as a dream, but as an object of memory. The attention of Poplavsky and other writers of the younger generation breaks away from its interest to present-day life, weakens and appeals to the past, which once more becomes the present. Bergson talks about this case as the ongoing present, which is encompassed as constantly moving. In the Waltz from the Merry Widow, Poplavsky recalls all of his pre-war childhood, which is given to him as a moving panorama. At the same time, memory, as Poplavsky emphasizes, doesn't realize itself in feeling, which is impossible to experience once again. Russia remains in the field of memory, but doesn't move to the field of the actually present. If memory is linked with Russia, then feeling is linked with France, with a new homeland. To reconcile memory with feeling, this is the task of young immigrant literature. We write about our unique experience, which is not Russian or French, but Parisian. Parisian experience is the experience of a new feeling of time, which is inseparably linked to the name of Bergson. Thank you.